Good morning, everyone. It's Mr. Pioric, and I'm here with a short little video to talk to you about some of the ideas that I like to talk about the most when it comes to chapter 6 of The Great Gatsby. There's a lot that goes on in this chapter. Obviously, this is the chapter after Gatsby and Daisy finally had their reunion, and we have the party at the end of the chapter that Daisy and Tom actually come to, and we have other stuff going on. But I want to focus in on the very beginning and the very ending of the chapter. In the very beginning, we get the story that Nick tells about Gatsby's true origins. Remember, Gatsby had kind of told him this wacky story about being rich, coming from the Midwest of San Francisco, and losing all his money, but also going around Europe, opening cases of rubies and chasing big game and being a war hero. We find out some of that is true, but not necessarily all of it. And I want to cover some of what's important about what is true about Gatsby. Not just his kind of humble beginnings, but also some specific characterizations about him or characteristics of him. So let's turn. For my book, it's really like the second page of chapter 6. It's the paragraph that starts out with, "I suppose he'd had the name ready." So we find out that James Gatz, that's his actual name, is from North Dakota. He was like a clam digger on Lake Superior, and is that the right lake? You know, one of those big lakes. Yeah, Lake Superior. And he was poor. His family were unsuccessful farmers. It was nothing like what he had said before. It's not some illustrious origin. He's a poor person that happens to be working at this lake, and he goes and rescues some guy whose yacht is about to, get wrecked up on the shore. And he has this name ready. He's going to introduce himself not as James Gatz. That guy's the boring son of poor farmers, but he's going to be Jay Gatsby, which is going to be this new persona he wants to create. Even back when he was 17. And I want to read about the origin of that persona. It's a very fascinating paragraph. It goes like this. "I suppose he'd had the name ready for a long time, even then. His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. His imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. The truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that, and he must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. So he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent, and to this conception he was faithful to the end." It's interesting. Couple things there. Let's talk about what it means to be the platonic conception of something. I have a whiteboard. I wasn't necessarily ready for this. But let's say we're talking about Plato. Plato was a famous Greek philosopher. That's where the word platonic comes from. And he believed that things on earth are merely just crude representations of things that exist on the ideal plane. I don't understand it all. It's kind of confusing, but that's the general idea. So say you are trying to build a chair. It's a chair. Now, you can build a chair, but it's never going to match up to the ideal conception of what a chair is. This is just your own ability to represent what a chair is in reality. It's just some physical manifestation of the ideal understanding of what a chair is. Everybody's trying to make a chair that really lives up to what a chair could and should be. Anyway, James Gatz is unhappy with who he actually is. So he's going to create, he's going to tap into what's the ideal version of what James Gatz is, and he's going to create that persona for himself, and he's going to name that persona Jay Gatsby. It's an interesting moment of creation. He is creative, and this is creation. And I'm going to return to that in a moment. But let's talk about, let's talk about that now. It says here that he was a son of God. A phrase which if it means anything, means just that. And he must be about his father's business. Now, the Son of God, what does God do? Especially Judeo-Christian God. What does he do? Well, lots of things. But one main thing that God does is he creates. He created the world and the universe. So if his business is creation, that's Jay Gatsby's or James Gatz's business. He creates. So he creates himself. He created parties. He created a library that exists only to be itself, not even to be read. It's got no function. It's just a creative vision. He's a man of vision. That's where this idea of being able to visualize the ideal version of something is important. He can do that, and he can make it happen. He idealizes what would be the perfect version of me, and then he sticks with it until it happens. But there's one interesting issue here. He, James Gatz, this won't be a very interesting picture of him. Let's say this is James Gatz. He's going to imagine boop, 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 boop. A fancier version of himself, Jay Gatsby. That's who he wants to be. Here, I'll make him kind of ideal like that chair. Bah! Now, this is what I think is interesting. It says, he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent. And most of you are 17 or around there. Not all of you are boys, but you're all 17-year-olds. Now, I often want my students to take a second and envision what would be the ideal version of themselves, say, around the age of 30. That's about how old Gatsby is here. Some of you, I often have students draw a picture or something, and often it's them swimming in swimming pools filled with cash, or married to Kylie Jenner, or Gigi Hadid, or some famous person, or married to, or maybe not even married to, but with, I don't know, who's a famous, like Thor, Chris Hemsworth. So they have these big dreams, but they're sometimes not that realistic. But either way, the interesting thing to me is that he sticks with it. And he becomes that Jay Gatz that he had dreamed of when he was 17. He lives his life, but the problem is to a certain degree, although he's moving in his life in this future, he's also kind of moving backwards because he's never moving into a new dream of himself. He's always looking back at what he wanted to be when he was 17. And you'll find out that although Gatsby is great at dreams, he's not so great at reality. He's not great at understanding that he cannot create everything how he wants it to be, but also there's some element of time travel going on here where he's becoming what he should have been 17 years ago. It reminds me of when you see the light of a star, you're seeing it not for what it looks like now, but how it looked like thousands of years ago, depending how far away it is. So we're seeing him become what he wanted to be in the past. This kind of stunted version of self-realization. But he's also not realizing himself and learning about himself. He's always moving towards becoming that thing he wanted to be. I don't want to make this too complicated, but I do think it's an interesting idea. And it's going to kind of have another iteration at the end of chapter 6, when Nick realizes, oh, you're just trying to go back to the past. You want Daisy to pretend that she never married Tom and pretend that the last 5 years, which include her having a child with Tom, never happened. He says that Nick says that he could tell that Gatsby wanted them to go back to Louisville and be married from her house just as if it were 5 years ago. And Nick says this to Gatsby as a way of consolation and a reality check, and he says, well, I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. So we see Gatsby has trouble with this reality, that this is not the same Daisy. He can never reclaim that Daisy. She's gone. He doesn't even realize that he can't recreate that Gatsby. That Gatsby is gone. He has trouble with the reality, even though he's so good at creating his vision. Why should we care so much about Gatsby's feelings about Daisy? Well, I love the end of this chapter, and I want to read it to you a little bit. And it has to do with this idea of the creative power of Gatsby. It's a beautiful passage, and it goes like this. Nick recounts a past moment in Gatsby's life, and he says this. One autumn night, 5 years before, they, Gatsby and Daisy, had been walking down the street when the leaves were falling, and they came to a place where there were no trees and the sidewalk was white with moonlight. They stopped here and turned toward each other. Now it was a cool night with that mysterious excitement in it which comes at the two changes of the year. The quiet lights in the houses were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and bustle among the stars. Out of the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalks really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb to it, if he climbed alone. And once there, he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. Let's talk about this ladder. What's he talking about? Well, here's a crude illustration. Let's say it's the top of a hill. And you have the sidewalk. Let's say we're on the street and we see the sidewalk. If you want some trees, I'll give you some trees. There's some trees up there. And if you think about the blocks of a sidewalk and how they look, if you're looking up the hill, they kind of look like that. And here's Gatsby's ladder. Where does the ladder lead to? He says a secret place. But where does it kind of actually lead to? Here. What's this line called? This line is the horizon. Can you even read that? I know it's very messy. I don't know if that helps. It's the horizon. The horizon is something that you can never get. You can never get to it. It always keeps going eternally in front of you. You can never reach it. It is the unreachable future. But it's also something that represents unlimited possibility. What could lie ahead in the future? You never know. There could be any amount of possibilities that lie in the future. What Gatsby sees is that if he goes off on his own with his own kind of creative powers, ability to realize dreams, he could have anything. He could drink the incomparable milk of wonder of life. But he has to do it alone, realize his own dreams. And this is a moment of choice for him. Because we read, he looks up, sees the possibilities, the endless possibilities he could have for himself if he lived his own life. But then he looks at Daisy. And it says, his heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. Remember him being the Son of God? He can do whatever he wants, but if he links himself to her, he's bound to her, and that's his future. He's choosing his future right now if he chooses her. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. If you know what incarnation means, it means something that becomes flesh. It's most famously used to describe when Jesus came to earth as God in the form of a human, the incarnation of Christ. Here we have, who's also, of course, famously known as the Son of God. Here we have Gatsby becoming flesh by linking his dreams to Daisy. He no longer can do whatever he wants to. He has to choose, he chooses her as his future. And so once we see this, we see what he's to a certain degree sacrificed by linking himself up to Daisy and why he can't just let go of her. He built his entire future on her. Now, if you remember him looking back at that 17-year-old version, we know that Gatsby has trouble letting go of his dreams of the past. So this will be quick. But if you have Gatsby and Daisy 5 years ago, and Gatsby's dreaming of them being married forever, and you get 5 years later, old Jay Gatsby he is going to want still to reclaim that vision of the past. Right? He can't let go of it. That's his platonic ideal of his life now. He's given it over to Daisy. It's no longer his own. So it's interesting. But it also shows how beautiful the dream is, but also how it's always going to come into conflict with the reality. It also shows that dreaming is fine. You can dream unlimited amounts of possibilities, but the reality will only be what that reality is. You lose the eternal possibility of the horizon, of the future, of the dream once you get the reality. Uh, Unfortunately, his reality has to do with him going to war, her marrying Tom, him coming back, and the whole world being different. Okay, next chapter, chapter 7, is the climax of the book. Lots of stuff, crazy stuff happens. Make sure you read it. I will talk to you guys next week.